As it heads into the final week of Parliament for the year, the government's challenges pile up. The opposition's on the warpath over detention laws. The states want more money and backbenchers are pressing for further cost of living relief. Christmas can't come soon enough. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. There's at least been some good news for the government. Inflation is heading down, which means another interest rate hike is looking less likely. And a deal was struck with the Greens and crossbench to save the Murray Darling Basin Plan. But on so many other fronts, the pressure is building ahead of a critical final week of Parliament. On Wednesday, the Prime Minister will meet state and territory leaders who want billions more from the Commonwealth. And by the end of the week, the government's determined to pass new laws modelled on the Coalition's own preventative detention regime for terrorists to lock back up at least some of those released from immigration detention. The opposition won't be making life easy for Labor. It reckons there was no need to release all of these detainees, and it's demanding an apology after the attacks on Peter Dutton from some ministers.
Today, the High Court published the reasons for its ruling almost 3 weeks ago that indefinite immigration detention is unlawful.
The High Court has left space for the Parliament to legislate to get the most dangerous offenders off the streets.
It is a very narrow ruling that relates specifically to the case of the applicant, NZYQ.
We are moving quickly to finalise a tough preventative detention regime before Parliament rises.
The High Court ordered one person. You released 140.
This is the first time I have ever heard you outright lie on camera.
This is the first time you've demonstrated such incompetence.
New laws to put people recently released from immigration detention back behind bars won't be ready until next week.
To do that, we are going to need Peter Dutton and the Liberals to work with us. They are very good at saying no.
And it's the pathway that the opposition has been recommending the government do for 3 weeks now.
We are not breaking for Christmas until we have a preventative detention regime in place.
Most former detainees have ankle tracking bracelets in place, but the whereabouts of one remains unknown.
And does the Minister know where this individual is now?
All efforts coordinated under Operation Aegis are being made to track down this individual.
Minister, why is your job safe when the Australian public is not?
While you are in meetings plotting about your political strategy, we're in meetings doing the work and solving the problems.
That missing detainee who'd been on the run from Border Force and the AFP has now been found.
It's time for Peter Dutton to stop saying no, stop slowing us down. Peter Dutton, Peter Dutton, Peter Dutton, Peter Dutton.
This is an incompetent, hopeless, hapless Home Affairs Minister.
Labor doubles down, accusing Peter Dutton of protecting pedophiles.
On Monday, the opposition, led by the Leader of the Opposition, come into the Parliament and vote to protect pedophiles over children.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, Peter Dutton did not support laws that we brought in earlier this week to make it a criminal offence for convicted pedophiles to go near schools.
I think the Labor Party, the Prime Minister, crossed the line this week. The fact is it's a complete opposite of the truth.
Are you prepared to repeat the accusation that Peter Dutton protects pedophiles?
They're not my words.
Will you take legal action?
I would wait to see whether there's an apology forthcoming and then make a decision after that.
And I would say to the Leader of the Opposition, he likes to get up and speak emotionally about child sexual abuse. He's got an opportunity to make a stand and I want him to do it.
And my guest this morning is the Greens Senator Sarah Hanson-Young. First, let's check what's making news. NDIS Minister Bill Shorten is raising the stakes ahead of negotiations with the states this week on reforming the scheme. News Corp papers report he's warning vulnerable Australians will die unless the states agree to changes aimed at weeding out dodgy providers. Meanwhile, the Nine papers report children with neurodevelopmental delays risk having the number of supports they access slashed by 2/3 if new restrictions are brought in to address cost blowouts. These reforms are set to be discussed at National Cabinet on Wednesday. I understand if implemented, the government argues it would achieve its goal of reducing the growth in the funding costs of the NDIS to 8% a year. In fact, just a little under that amount. The other big item on the government's to-do list this week is passing new preventative detention laws aimed at locking back up some of those released from immigration detention. The ABC understands the legislation is modelled on the high-risk terrorist offenders regime put in place when the coalition was in office. Under the legislation, the Immigration Minister can apply to a court for a preventative detention order based on the risk it believes an individual poses to the community. The Nine papers report Australia's former independent national security legislation monitor, who only left that post a week ago, has accused both sides of politics of whipping up fear and pursuing an unworkable regime. And a final one, News Corp papers suggest Josh Frydenberg may be eyeing a return to Kooyong. James Campbell reports Liberal MPs believe the former Treasurer is reconsidering his decision not to run in his old seat at the next election, with fresh polling showing he has a stronger chance of winning Kooyong back from independent Monique Ryan. The fresh polling is true, but sources close to Josh Frydenberg tell me he is not changing his position and won't be running. He's quite happy with his new job as chair of an investment bank and spending more time with the family. Now, last month's High Court ruling against indefinite immigration detention created a post-referendum headache the government's still struggling to manage. This week, with its new preventative detention regime, it really hopes to put this issue to bed. Modelling the regime on those coalition-era terrorist laws is really aimed at locking in the coalition's support, but bipartisanship will depend on the details. The opposition will want the toughest laws possible. The government needs to strike a balance to ensure the laws can also withstand a High Court challenge. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by Sam Maiden, David Crowe and Bridget Brennan. Very good morning to all of you. Look, before we get into the politics, and there was lots of it during the past week over this issue, let's look at the High Court's actual judgment, because we finally saw that on Tuesday. Sam, to you first, does it make clear whether the government was right to release the 140 plus detainees that it has?
Yes, well, putting on my hat as a well-known constitutional expert. Look, I think the problem is with the judgment that there's something in there for everyone. But I think when you read it, what it makes clear is that this gentleman was legally detained. The problem is the indefinite nature of it was against the Constitution, right? And so I think the government's got something to hang on to there, and that's obviously what the Solicitor General has found in his advice to the government.
Just on that, to show you the bit from the judgment that goes to that issue, that the problem's indefinite detention. It says the absence of any real prospect of achieving removal of the alien from Australia is in the reasonably foreseeable future.
So that's the baseline issue, and that's why I think that, you know, with that clip that you played, where people in the coalition were saying, oh, this only applies to, you know, one person.
Yeah, or even those who are serious child sex offenders.
Yeah, I think that is called, the technical term is complete nonsense, and there's other words that I could use that can't be said on television. It's not about one person, right? That they are saying that the Constitution says that you can't keep these people detained indefinitely where there's no prospect of release. However, the judgment does also specifically refer to the issue of the fact that, you know, there's no country that sort of, you know, countries don't line up to say, bring us your sex offenders.
Yeah, or murderers, or...
but there's a bit in the judgment where it's specifically talking about that.
Yeah.
And so perhaps that's what the coalition is hanging it on. They're saying that's...
Yeah, and you're right.
And they've released 140 people. They're not all sex offenders.
No, they're not. And they're not all murderers either. There's a range. And this is what the opposition's saying about that.
We think it is possible, maybe even probable, that some of those people who were released didn't need to be. I hope no additional people who don't need to be released are released. I hope the government redetains anyone who they can lawfully redetain.
The other thing I think is interesting about that judgment is that it's two of the some of the newest members of the High Court, two female High Court judges who have basically been initially the ones that sort of went, guys, hang on, like, I know we've got this judgment, but they had a complaint about the fact that they released the judgment without the reasons, which kind of then nobbled the government a little bit.
So, David, now we're onto, in the coming week, the government's effort in the final week of Parliament to try and fix this once and for all with a preventative detention regime. As I mentioned, it'll be modelled on the existing terrorist preventative detention regime. Bottom line, it's a court, though. A judge will decide who gets locked up. That means not all of those 140-odd are going to be locked up.
And that's an essential sort of feature of this entire debate, which I think in the politics is often ignored. I mean, the High Court has basically said, this is our reading of the Constitution. The fact is that all politicians have to abide by the rule of law. They can't make it up in Canberra and create a new regime that is also going to fall foul of the High Court.
Because that'd be the worst outcome for the government. When sometime next year, this blows up again when the High Court says that's not constitutional, you've got to release these people.
And getting back to Sam's point, they had to do something within the rule of law. Once the High Court decision was handed down, they had to release all of those in the same cohort, all of those in the same circumstances.
I don't know if they did have to release all of them.
Well, we don't know the individual circumstances for each of the 140 plus, right? We don't actually know that.
They were taking advice from the Solicitor General on this.
Which we won't get to see.
We won't get to see. But what would be their motivation in releasing anyone they didn't have to?
Yeah. Well, sometimes, I mean, these things ultimately are a question of legal debate and discussion, right?
Sure.
And
but the government's got to listen to its Solicitor General. It can't.
Well, sure, but I think that there's advice, but sometimes lawyers can err too far, and I mean it's an opinion at the end of the day. That's the problem, right? It's one person.
And plenty of them have been wrong.
And the challenge from now on is how do they craft a new regime that can be legally robust, and it gets back to the terrorism law that you mentioned. That is the template here, because there's an existing regime where a terrorist who's suspected of committing future offences, somebody has to look into the future and say that person's going to offend again, can be held in indefinite detention under a continuing detention order.
And I don't know if you're going to play the clip, but I am in no way reassured by Claire O'Neill saying, not that long ago, we didn't know what an ankle monitor was, and now we're putting them on everybody.
It was an interesting comment that Home Affairs didn't own an ankle bracelet, and it just sort of goes to how they're scrambling to keep up with all of this.
And the other difficulty is we have had very little information about the kind of crimes committed or alleged to have committed of these 140 people. All the nuance has been lost for the people that some human rights organisations are saying shouldn't have to go back to a court, right?
Information.
Well,
some, but
categories,
it's not,
but nothing
there's
specific.
not a huge amount of information.
So how do they make a judgment when they go to a judge and say, look, we think the risk of future offending is so great that for community safety we need a continuing detention order? That's the regime that we seem to be heading towards. We won't know until, I think, on Monday when they put this new proposal to the Parliament, and then it's going to have to be voted on by Thursday when the House rises. So there's a limited amount of time to figure out exactly how this is going to work.
I'm sure it's not the whole reason, but it's also a bit politically deft to then hand it over to the judges, because then you can say, well, it's the judges that are saying they don't need an ankle bracelet.
Well, yeah.
Instead
and
of putting Andrew Giles in charge of it all.
Some judges take a dim view of re-detaining people who've served a criminal sentence. I mean, we have a pretty well-established rule of law.
But the High Court's making it clear now in a series of judgments that the view is that the government can't be, the minister can't be the one punishing people. Only a court can do that. So this is all about shifting that power, as you say, to a court, to a judge to decide whether someone is punished.
And this is the interesting challenge that's been mounted by David Mann on behalf of an Afghan refugee who was given refugee status, committed an offence that was then subject to a $2,000 fine but not a jail term, and now has an ankle bracelet on and a curfew. And the argument from David Mann is that that is punishment. And you can't have
another
punishment.
High Court case.
Yeah, well, you will. Yeah, you'll have this concept of punishment without that's not ordered by a court is actually now totally subject.
And then
to
on the politics
dispute.
of all of this, so during the week, I think it was Monday, the government tried to toughen up those monitoring requirements even further, prevent pedophiles going anywhere near a school and so on. Opposition didn't think this went far enough. They wanted the preventative detention order days ago and were demanding that, so they voted against it. And that, of course, led to this charge from the Home Affairs Minister.
The opposition, led by the Leader of the Opposition, come into the Parliament and vote to protect pedophiles over children. That's what they did. Voted to protect pedophiles over children.
Look, Labor points out that Peter Dutton's got a record himself of using similar language. He once accused the Queensland Premier of siding with pedophiles. He's still got the tweet up there for all to see. He accused Labor generally of backing pedophiles over Australian kids. None of it's terribly edifying though, Bridge, is it?
Deeply unedifying. It's sort of like you go low, we'll go lower kind of rhetoric, and also deeply unhelpful for the Australian community who want to understand more about quite a complex debate, and just really difficult for someone at home to understand who are these people, what is the plan, can we have a reasoned debate in the Parliament, a really ugly feature of our political debate really on display this week.
Yeah, and look, clearly Peter Dutton is not a protector of pedophiles.
But he voted against a bill, and when you vote against a bill, you have to own that. You have to be held accountable.
But does that mean everything's off limits? You can call someone
But I think everybody can see that the rhetoric is totally overblown. But he did have to answer the fact that they voted against the bill. I mean, when they voted against that bill at 5:30 on Monday, I could not see in all their arguments any substantive point about what they were opposing. I think when you look at the politics of that week, they should have voted for that bill. By the way, it hasn't even gone through the Senate, so it isn't actually made law. A lot of this is just a debating point. I think the rhetoric is overblown, but Peter Dutton wasn't the only one voting against that bill. The Teals voted against it. The Greens voted against it as well.
But you saw, it was an interesting moment, Sam, because you saw all the coalition frontbenchers lining up to demand apologies and express outrage about what had been said about their leader. And it clearly had an impact, because then you had Bill Shorten, you had Richard Marles, and then Anthony Albanese himself refusing to echo that same line.
Well, I think it is one of those situations where, yes, Peter Dutton has plenty of form saying things like that. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, because I can't remember if it was Scott Morrison, but you remember all the stuff about Anthony Albanese being a Manchurian candidate.
That was Scott Morrison.
And all of this stuff about, you know, the links with the Chinese, and Dutton's definitely gotten into that, even if you didn't use that specific terminology, right? But I think it is one of those situations where two wrongs don't make a right. And the reason why I think it's a stupid thing to say in terms of the Labor Party is because I think most sentient people, even if Peter Dutton is not their cup of tea, do not think that he's a protector of pedophiles. And so it's dumb politically, because anyone listening to it would think that doesn't seem right. I mean, he's a cop, he likes locking people up, right?
Well, the PM wasn't giving apologies. He was defending his ministers even if he wasn't repeating the line.
I'm accountable for what I say, and he has accused consistently those ministers. And what the ministers said was that his opposition to the legislation that was before the Parliament on Monday is completely inconsistent with what he has said.
Yeah, so where does
But that's right, it was inconsistent.
Yeah,
but
with the way that
point taken that the rhetoric is overblown, and I don't think it sticks. I don't think it's actually that bad for the government to make it about Peter Dutton in the way that they have. However, I think it'll move on in the coming week because it becomes about the new bill.
And I mean, this is a landmark decision. It's a real moment after 20 years of the lockstep policy on a human rights issue that should have had a reasoned debate in the Parliament, and it's just turned into a kind of mudslinging, which I think is just
Look,
really
it's a good point. And this week too, this is going to be done lickety-split, right? They're going to introduce this legislation. It goes to Cabinet tomorrow morning. Legislation will come in. They want to pass by the end of the week. But we are talking about a serious change. I mean, the existing preventative detention regime was a painstaking process putting that in place. This one's going to happen.
I think it is a very dangerous moment for the Albanese government, and there are surely people within the government like Anthony Albanese and Chris Bowen would remember very clearly what happened to the Gillard government with the High Court decision in terms of their offshore detention, and it has echoes of that. And what happened when that we were told, oh, it's fine, we're just going to get rid of offshore detention, nothing will happen. And before you know it, all the boats turned up, and people forget that was one of the big reasons why Julia Gillard got whacked, politically speaking. And so there's a lot of danger in this moment, because this is just going to provide fodder for the coalition for ages. There's 100 and however many people running around with ankle bracelets. Like, it's just going to be stories for days.
We'll come back to how the government's tracking generally as this year comes to an end. Time, though, now to talk to the Greens spokesperson for Environment, Water, Arts and Communication, Sarah Hanson-Young, who struck a deal with Labor this week to save the Murray Darling Basin Plan by allowing voluntary water buybacks to resume. To take us there, here was the angry reaction from the Nationals.
All of the basin communities who all wanted to be heard, who weren't consulted, who asked for their interests to be protected, have basically today just been, for want of a better word, shafted. But this isn't just those communities that are going to pay for this bill. This bill will hit the hip pockets of every Australian, because anything that impacts our farm productivity will impact our grocery prices in the long run. We listened to the people of the basin who asked to ensure that there were social and economic protections put into this bill, who asked to keep the cap on buybacks.
Sarah Hanson-Young, welcome to the program.
Good morning, thanks for having me.
Have regional communities been shafted?
Absolutely not, and frankly, after a decade of the National Party doing everything they can to wind back the Murray Darling Basin Plan, to keep that over-extraction of water, particularly to those big corporate irrigators, going at the expense of actually river communities who need a healthy river in order for those communities to be viable. The legislation that finally passed the Parliament this week is a good piece of legislation. It's a win for the environment, it's a win for the river, and it's a breakthrough for my home state in South Australia.
But for those regional communities, the concern for the Nats and farming groups is that some farmers will cash in with the water buybacks, sell their rights, their water rights, shift to the coast or the city, leaves that regional community without that industry, will also push up food and fibre prices. Is that right?
Well, I take my advice from the learned experts at agencies like the Productivity Commission on this, who say that water buybacks are the most efficient, both economically and environmentally, to deliver what we need to do, which is to put more water back in the river in order to give it a fighting chance.
But for the regional community, what's the impact there?
Well, we need to make sure that those communities are supported if there does need to be some kind of transition. But these are voluntary. But these are voluntary buybacks. So I just want to be clear. A farmer can sell their water to anyone at the moment. They can sell it to big corporate cotton. They can sell it to foreign water ownership. They can sell it to the Canadian pension funds.
But now you've got a new and very big buyer in the market.
But they can't sell it to the government to give to the environment. It's a bit ridiculous.
But now you can.
Yes.
And so
it needs to happen.
You talk about transition, payments for regional communities?
There is a package within this reform that allows for proper assessment for the community. What does the community need? A fund by which can be used to help communities in that transition. But we have to save the river, David. We're heading into a climate crisis. Greed and self-interest has ruled the day on the management of the Murray-Darling for decades. It's time that comes to an end if we're to have a river that is living and sustainable, flowing in years to come.
Just one point of detail on what's been agreed here. One of the amendments given to the independent David Van to get this through is to allow farmers to lease back their water rather than sell their water to the government. It could even be a 12-month lease he's talking about. Is a 12-month water lease really going to save the river?
Well, I think what this has done is allowed another tool in the toolbox for the government and the environmental water holder, the Commonwealth environmental water holder, to look at if there's a particular area that needs water for the environment at that point, and there's a willing seller or somebody who's willing to lease that water, that can be done. We're at crisis point with this river. I live at the bottom end. Of course, as South Australians, we know how dire it is if you don't have enough environmental flows coming downstream. And my community, we are so worried about what this summer's going to bring. Bushfires, more heat, and the dredging of the Murray Mouth means our water supply is at risk.
Just on a political point, when you announced this deal, I think we've got it here, you held a joint news conference, a joint doorstop there with Tanya Plibersek. Now, I point this out because we don't see this very often. Greens did a few deals this year with the government on climate change and housing, and you never did this. In fact, this is the first time the Greens and Labor, as I understand it, have done a joint press conference since 2011 when Julia Gillard was in office. Whose idea was this?
Oh, look, I think this is a really wonderful image, because it shows that when people from different sides can work together, can be constructive in negotiations, that you can stand shoulder to shoulder and say, all right, here's a good outcome for everyone. We may not have gotten everything we wanted. Tanya wanted some other things. I wanted a bit more on some other things. But at the end of the day, we delivered an outcome that's good for the environment.
But the Greens will still be trying to take her seat of Sydney at the next election?
Well, of course, if you care about the environment, if you want stronger action on climate change, you want to end native forest logging, there's only one party who stands solid on that, and that's the Greens.
Look, I'm not sure if you talked about this with Tanya Plibersek, but in Parliament this coming week, the government is hoping to pass what's called its Nature Repair Market Bill. So this would give landholders tradable certificates when they agree to protect or restore a wetland, some sort of environmental space. They get a certificate they can then sell to a business. Now, where are you at on this idea?
This piece of legislation has been in a long-held Senate inquiry. We've got big concerns about this way the legislation is currently drafted, and as it's currently drafted, the Greens can't support it. The idea of allowing the protection of one part of nature, in a particular area of koala habitat, to be saved in order to justify the destruction of nature somewhere else, I mean, that's bonkers. So that's not environmental protection.
If a company's using it to offset environmental damage they're doing elsewhere, that's a red line.
That's a red line for us. I want to see the offsets gone. If the offsets go, then I'm happy to sit down with the government and talk about where we go next.
Okay, we've been talking about the other big priority for the government this week, and that's the preventative detention regime to lock back up at least some of those who've been released from immigration detention. What do the Greens think about the idea here of having a court at least decide who should be put back behind bars?
Well, look, we haven't seen any of the detail of this yet. It hasn't even been to Cabinet, first of all. And the way the government has managed this has been appalling, David. And the only reason this legislation is now being brought into the Parliament this week is because they stuffed up the first time, because they rushed it too fast. They didn't wait for the High Court reasons to be handed down. Peter Dutton said boo, and the government went to water. And the hysteria around this, the whipping up of fear, and the chief of the National Security Watchdog this morning calling it out for what it is, saying that both sides have behaved disgracefully on this, that they have whipped up fear and hysteria. Of course, the chief whipper-upper of all is Peter Dutton. Let's not pretend otherwise. He's built his entire career on this stuff, and unfortunately, the Labor Party have fallen for it.
So you won't support any sort of preventative detention regime?
Look, we are not interested in doing anything that undermines what the High Court has called on the Australian Parliament to do.
The High Court was quite clear in leaving open the prospect. It suggested the prospect, if you like, of a preventative detention regime.
Yes, well, we will look at the details, but we're worried about the first bill that went through the Parliament already.
But this one you're not opposed to necessarily?
Well, we haven't seen it, David. I mean, this is the ludicrous situation that we're in. Okay. There's no details. The government wants to ram this through the Senate in the next three or 4 days. This is knee-jerk hysteria policy making. It's a kind of a moral panic
but I'm just interested that you're not completely ruling it out. If the coalition says what they put up is not tough enough, it sounds like...
Oh, look, we are not in any way interested in playing footsies with the Labor Party under the table on this at all. There is a race to the bottom here. This is all about making refugees and migrants a group in our community that people are afraid of. I've debated immigration policy in this country for a long time, and it's Groundhog Day. It's revolting. I think it's dangerous. I think the type of behaviour exhibited by Peter Dutton in particular and his front bench, I mean, it's a risk to social cohesion in this country.
But just to be clear though, if it would be a judge deciding that a child sex offender, for example, still poses a risk to the community,
yes,
needs to be behind bars.
Well, we've always said that it should be a judge that makes the decision about immigration, how long someone is in immigration, the purposes for why they're in immigration detention. It should be a judge that decides who, the terms and the length of somebody's prison term. So we will look at the detail, but we are not prepared to simply play footsies with Labor because, even Peter Dutton is now going too far for them.
A couple of other things. Supermarkets. The Greens have won support for a Senate inquiry into the big supermarkets and alleged price gouging. What do you want to achieve here? Is this a new front for the Greens in going after the supermarkets?
Well, this is going to be a good inquiry and an important one because we know cost of living is going through the roof right now. People are finding it really tough, and in the lead up to Christmas, I think people are feeling that more than ever. The cost of people's supermarket trolley at the end of the week is becoming a really hard thing to bear week in, week out. I've been talking to parents in my electorate who are wondering whether they should even, enrol their kids in the school holiday programs. Are they going to have the ability to afford that and the Christmas lunch? I think we do need to crack down on this. This inquiry will look at the duopoly between Coles and Woolworths. It will consider price gouging. It'll consider whether the ACCC needs more powers. I hear Alan Felsout, the former ACCC chair this morning, backing this in. We do need a focus on these big corporations who take so much out of the pockets of families and Australians while raking in billions of dollars worth of profits. I mean, it's pretty sick, isn't it, that Woolworths has had $1 billion of profit this year, and yet Australians are struggling to pay their food bills.
The government, on another front, is wanting to change the laws applying to the television and streaming industry now. The anti-siphoning list, which is aimed at protecting certain certain major sporting events for free-to-air television, extending that to streaming services, and what's called the prominence provisions, so that smart TVs prominently display free-to-air platforms ahead of others. Looks like the government will need the Greens on this. So what's your position?
Well, we're not going to rubber stamp it. What we know is needed is a really root and branch overhaul of media regulation and rules. The world is different. We watch news and consume our content and media in very different ways now, and the laws are not fit for purpose. I want a full-blown inquiry, a royal commission into media ownership and regulation in this country. There's no point doing piecemeal and not actually dealing with the big issue. I want to see Australian sport free for people to be able to view on the devices by which they need to view it and the devices they use to watch sport. I want to make sure that our Australian content rules are fit for purpose and modern. You should be able to turn on the television and see Australian content that's made by Australians for Australians in Australian accents front and centre.
But if these changes progress that agenda, maybe not the Royal Commission you're talking about, but Australian content and free-to-air access for sport and other major events, you'd support it, wouldn't you?
We are going to look at it, but I really do worry the government on and warn the government on the fact that there is a big desperate need for overhaul of media regulation, and just taking one bit is not going to fix the problem. We don't just watch television on free-to-air on the old TV set anymore. We need rules that are fit for purpose.
Final one, there have been growing calls for a Royal Commission into domestic and family violence, particularly after some terrible numbers out of your home state, South Australia. 4 women killed in the space of a week.
It was horrific.
The state government is considering a Royal Commission. What's your view?
Well, we need one, and I really do urge the South Australian government and the Premier, Peter Malinauskas, to do this. And 4 women in a week was a pretty hard statistic to bear. I was shocked by it. The South Australian community really were outraged. They were frustrated. There's been an outpouring of concern and anger, and people are looking around going, we talk about this issue, but what's really changing? That we are in the midst of a domestic violence epidemic, and in any other epidemic, you'd put all of the forces, in the bucket, the shoulder to the wheel, and you'd do something. It feels that when it's violence against women, when it's sexual assault, when it's domestic violence, it's kind of put in a too hard basket. Well, we've had enough. South Australians have had enough. Australian women have had enough, and it's time that governments took this seriously.
Look, it's an interesting point you make. If this was some other type of crime that was seeing this number of deaths,
yes, Murders, David.
Murders. Why?
Women murdered by people that they know, men in their lives.
Why?
It's not like we don't know who these people are.
Why do you think this isn't attracting more attention and action?
I think it is a long suffering societal problem, David, and it's time that this changed. Women have had enough. Our children have had enough. And decent men in this country are sick of it too. It needs to change.
Sarah Hanson-Young, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Well, coming up, we're going to turn to Pat Dodson, who's announced during the week that he's leaving Parliament, calling quits on his 7-year political career. Of course, his career in public life a lot longer than that, the so-called father of reconciliation. He had some interesting comments about the Voice referendum result as well. We'll get to that. First, let's return to our panel. We're joined once again by Samantha Maiden, David Crowe and Bridget Brennan. Look, just to pick up on a couple of things, Bridge, domestic violence, clearly Sarah Hanson-Young, big supporter of the Royal Commission. Does seem to be some momentum, particularly in South Australia, for a state-based Royal Commission. But it's right, isn't it, that if this was deaths at the hands of terrorists, for example, we'd have a very different reaction right now in the country.
We'd have a very different media reaction. I've covered this throughout my career. It's very rare to see the deaths of Australian women, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, make the front pages of the newspaper. And as you say, David, if it was any other crime, any other victim survivor, we would be seeing a coalescence of media forces in this country really stepping up to put pressure on governments and agencies for more accountability in the systems that really disenfranchise women in this country. Now, we've had a Royal Commission in Victoria, which was very comprehensive and very needed in Victoria. You are now seeing better processes, a lot more money flowing into the system to ensure that agencies are able to really work together to ensure the protection of women. But yeah, this is an absolute crisis, as the Senator just said, and we do need a better response from all governments.
Now, and just another one on preventative detention. Sarah Hanson-Young not ruling out talking to the government about what they're going to do. You'd find it surprising, though, David, wouldn't you, if they have to turn to the Greens to get this done?
Yeah, I think that on preventative detention, we've got a bill that should be revealed on Monday. The House doesn't meet till Thursday, so the Senate's got plenty of time. Plenty of time on the standards of the last couple of weeks to then consider this by Wednesday. I can see a chance for the coalition to argue strongly about this in the first half of the week and then, vote in favour of change on Thursday when the House rises up the last day of the year for the Parliament.
Well, let's turn to the other big event that'll be happening this week. That's Wednesday's National Cabinet meeting, and this is another front where the Prime Minister's got to try and win some support. You've got three main issues, if you like, in dispute. The states and territories want more dough from the Commonwealth in what's called GST top-up payments.
Just for a change.
Yeah, they're meant to run out in 2027. They want it permanent, the top-ups that were agreed by the former coalition government when it comes to the GST. They want more money for hospital funding as well. The Commonwealth wants the states to shoulder more of the costs of the NDIS. Now, from what I'm told, there is a deal on the table. This was discussed at the Treasurers' meeting on Friday when the state and federal treasurers met. No deal done yet. The federal government's hopeful, of course, a deal will be done on Wednesday. I'm told that the Commonwealth's pitch is it does leave the states better off if you include all of these things: hospital funding, the GST, they'll do a bit on that, and what they're asking the states to do on the NDIS. But look, there's no guarantees about where this will land. Sam, what do you think? We've seen plenty of funding fights over the years between the states and the feds.
Yeah, there's nothing new about it, but I do think it's a little bit tricky for the government because it may turn out that it is politically advantageous for state premiers, particularly ones that are, got elections looming, to basically start toweling up Anthony Albanese, even though, it's a little bit counterintuitive because they're Labor governments. I mean, the one thing that really focuses the minds is elections and self-preservation. And so if you have a situation where you have Labor premiers starting to blame Canberra, inverted commas, for their problems, that can, that's going to pile up the problems for Anthony Albanese.
Well, I mean, they met, as I say, on Friday. The Treasurers, apparently it was all very amicable, but after the meeting, the State Treasurers then issued a pretty terse statement where they're basically saying, unless you give us the money for the GST top-up payments, here it is, without the guarantee, the Commonwealth will be fully responsible if states and territories are forced to consider a new tax or levy to ensure essential services aren't compromised
Albo
or reduced.
tax.
Give us the money or we'll hit the taxpayers.
And that's the job of the state treasurers, to muscle up on the Friday to set the scene for the Wednesday National Cabinet meeting where Albanese has to get an outcome. And to Sam's point, Queensland being the state that's got an election coming up soonest, it's Anastasia Palaszczuk who's going hard against the feds, and Cameron Dick, the state treasurer, who's been pretty hard against Catherine King, the infrastructure minister in Canberra. So it's Queensland that's the edgiest here in terms of pushing back on Canberra. However, there is a grand deal that can be done, and I think on balance probably will be done, but the states can't get everything they want on GST, because if Canberra were to agree, if Jim Chalmers was to agree to what the states want on GST, he'd be putting Canberra on the hook for $33 billion over about a decade, because the GST arrangement that Scott Morrison put in place was meant to cost $6 or $7 billion over that time frame. Things have changed, the cost has blown out, it has to be addressed, but I think pretty clearly it won't be addressed at next Wednesday's meeting. There'll be an interim arrangement and it will continue. It'll be reviewed in 2026, maybe we'll see change after that. But it can't, it's just unsustainable over the long term.
Yeah.
But with a bit of security on GST in the near term, the states will be in a better position with some money on hospitals to then accept what they've got to do on the NDIS. Because Bill Shorten, in order to get to the target of 8% and make NDIS costings sustainable over the longer term, Bill Shorten needs the states to do a little bit more of the help with children,
and I just want to unpack that, right? Because we'll get this NDIS reform that a lot of people in the sector have been waiting for. We're going to get that this week on Wednesday, and it'll go to the National Cabinet. We'll see if they make a decision on it. What the government's already baked into the budget is to reduce the growth in the NDIS, currently growing at 14%. They want it to grow at 8%. The deal they've put on the table, as I understand it, gets them there. In fact, just a little bit better than that. We'll talk about this on next week's program when we see all the detail of this. But a lot of families will be sweating on this as well, right, to see what it's going to mean for particularly kids with autism or neurodivergent kids as well, and what supports they're going to be on or off the NDIS. What are the states going to be able to offer?
This is the whole problem with the NDIS, right? Like, I think when the NDIS first came out, I think people thought it was for people that were, you know, sort of catastrophically injured and all the rest of it, right? It's the big growth a lot of the time in the NDIS is around autism, ADHD, things like that. Now, don't get me wrong, those things are very important, but it's become this beast that I don't think people thought it was going to be in the beginning. And there's a lot of complaints that the states are no longer providing some services that they used to and putting it all on the NDIS. And just picking up on that GST discussion as well, there's so many straws in the wind now about this issue. You've got the complaint over the GST, you've got the fight over the infrastructure that you referred to in terms of Catherine King. Yeah. But the other thing that people don't talk about enough is schools funding. So there's this whole agreement on Gonski that the states were meant to put in more money and they're not. I'm not one of those people who thinks that you solve problems in education by throwing more money at it. I think you might want to throw a bit more basic teaching at it. But, there's a whole bunch of areas here now where the states, sure, they're good at delivering services, but it doesn't mean that they're always good at spending
just
money.
On this, right, just on that point, the Commonwealth payments to the states are already rising as a percentage of national GDP, largely thanks to the housing and the skills funding deals that were done.
And the states are not putting in what they promised on Gonski.
And most states, by the way, are forecast to be in surplus in a couple of years. The Commonwealth will still be in deficit, is the forecast anyway. So their argument is, we're giving you more already.
There's a whole realignment.
I don't know if that's the case in Victoria. I reckon they might be.
They're going to be in deficit for quite a while.
Especially when you look at infrastructure, there's a realignment of state-federal financial relations.
Yeah.
In terms of the Fed saying, sorry, we cannot sustain all the things that you've become used to us doing for you. And that's tough for the states at the moment because under NDIS, they became accustomed to the NDIS taking a lot of the load. Now they've got to take more of the load, perhaps in the school system, and that is a challenge for them.
And they're going to need specialist teachers and all of that. Meanwhile, as I mentioned, the good news for the government during the week was the inflation number coming down from 5.6 to 4.9%. Bit of breathing room, perhaps, on interest rates. If it had gone the other way, I'm sure the government would be panicking at the end of this year because we talk about a lot of things, but cost of living is still underlying, Bridge. Such a problem for the government, big issue for so many households out there.
Yeah, and what they're hearing from the government is what the government's already done, but perhaps they need to hear about what more the government can do.
Do you think that list they keep giving of what they announced back in May is...
Let's talk a lot about the childcare subsidy, which has helped a lot of families somewhat, but you're still going to the Bowser and the petrol prices are enormous, the supermarket costs are crazy. I mean, look, in my family, the KK gift limit's gone up because, $50 isn't buying much at the moment. But yeah, it is a real, people are in real distress at the moment, and you're saving for a mortgage, if you're paying a rent, there's still not enough debate about renters in this country. We still haven't had an election that's been focused on a very large proportion of Australians who are renting and can't ever see themselves buying a house. So this is a growing proportion in the Australian community. I think the interesting thing for the government is, are they leaving Labor and going to the coalition, or will those votes go to the Greens and the Independents at the next election?
Well, the Greens polling is ticking up, which is interesting.
The government recites this list of all the things that they've done.
Yeah.
And the reality of politics is, the question from voters is, what have you done for me lately?
It's a drop
what are
in
you
the
doing
ocean.
for me next?
Yeah.
And reciting the list is not working for them, I think. And that's why some Labor MPs said on Tuesday in their caucus meeting, can we meet you please, Mr Chalmers, and have a discussion about what's coming next on budget policy. So they had that meeting and they had a discussion about what to do further on cost of living. And I think that there are some valid ideas there. There are things that Labor MPs like. One of them, Jerome Laxale from Bennelong, went on Facebook after the meeting and talked about this. Existing measures that they've done, could we extend the eligibility? And that's things like energy bill relief. Could they actually widen that? And I think that's the kind of thing to look for next year.
Extending things they're already doing. This is diabolically difficult though, right? You put too much money in, you're going to make the inflation problem worse, but people are screaming out for help. As I mentioned, Sam, we're towards the end of the year, government's come off in the polls, it's got all these things going on, it needs to settle this immigration detention issue, but cost of living will still be the big one heading into next year. Maybe things get a bit better if inflation keeps coming down.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you view where they're at?
Well, I had someone in the government ring me this week and say to me, oh, wow, did you think the wheels would come off this fast? And I've got to say I always did a bit, because I just don't think that Anthony Albanese's very good at retail politics always. During the election, he sort of stumbled about little things and things like that. And then he's great in Parliament, he's really good at running Parliament, and he ran Parliament really well during when they had the minority government. But I don't think he's really great at the retail politics. And so, look, I think the fundamental also problem, which is a sort of process thing a bit, is that I think that he doesn't necessarily really like, for example, his media unit, his media team to know much about what's going on, and as a result, they can't tell you what's going on. And I think there is a bit of dysfunction there. I mean, I don't know what you think, David, but I feel like it is definitely, you get the least information out of this PMO than any PMO I've worked with in 25 years. They just can't tell you what's going on with things when you ask about things.
I almost wrote this the other day,
and that's the Prime Minister's fault. It's not their fault.
I thought some of their spin is quite cynical. They put out lines that I don't think are really going to wash in the real world. But I also think there's a sort of a sleepy media management too often. They're not quite on top of things and proactive enough. One caucus member put it this way to me the other day. It's not the events themselves that cause such trouble for this government, it's lack of preparation for them and then inadequate response to them. And so I think that's the challenge for the government at the moment. They're in a midterm slump. There are ways out of it, but I think becoming more proactive and having a better radar system so that you're seeing what's coming up and you're better prepared for it is fundamental, and I think that's the way out.
And just quickly, the other thing that I find curious though, and it may be that I just don't understand politics, but they just go on and on about Peter Dutton. It's all they talk about. He's not the Prime Minister. Stop talking about him. He's the leader of the opposition. Why are they so obsessed with him?
Yeah, targeting Scott Morrison was the key to victory at the last election. Look, maybe he pulls out of the slump. Worth remembering the history, though.
And I'm sure they will. It's very unusual for a first-term government to do that.
The last Prime Minister to win 2 elections back-to-back, John Howard nearly 20 years ago. So it's been a while. Anyway, I just want to move on.
It's about holding their nerve. It's about holding their nerve and getting through it, which
you never know what's around the corner.
Doable.
Something could happen that would mean that they could increase their majority, but they don't look like doing
Amidst
that
all
now.
of this, during the week, a true giant of the parliament, I think it's fair to call him, Pat Dodson, announced he was calling it quits. He's been in parliament 7 years, of course, in public life for decades, known as the father of reconciliation. And he made some really interesting points about where the Voice referendum defeat has left the nation.
You now have in this country an Australian problem. It's a problem for Australia. The 60-40 split of that vote makes it an Australian problem. It's not an Aboriginal problem. We need to seriously think now of the way in which our civil society knits together with its diversity and differences. We can't take that for granted, and it's not just First Nations peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. This is an Australian problem we now have, and it's the legacy of the success of the no voters.
He's been fighting cancer, of course, which kept him out of a lot of that referendum campaign. Look, I thought that media conference I was there, it wasn't an angry spray. He wasn't putting forward solutions necessarily either, but he is bridge highlighting something that does remain unresolved.
What he's saying is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country have got the solutions, have put forward the solutions over many years. I mean, he was a commissioner on the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody nearly 2 decades ago. So the wisdom, the understanding, the solutions, the policy solutions are all there. This was actually what the Voice debate centred about. It was actually about, should we have Indigenous people having more of a say in the policy that affects our lives? So there is a sense of frustration, I think, given he has been in every single major fight about Indigenous rights over the past kind of 4 or 5 decades, that there hasn't been enough listening in the Parliament and elsewhere to those Indigenous voices that are...
And do you think the government's getting closer to charting a way forward, or will that come next year sometime?
I think there's been some disappointment in the First Nations community. Look, there was a lot of depression after the result in the First Nations community. I think people were exhausted. A lot of those leaders who led that movement towards the referendum were just completely exhausted and needed to have a break. There has been, I understand, a lot of meetings, a lot of coming together of different groups to look at solutions, but there are different ideas on how to do that. So it is a difficult point for the government. I think they don't want to rush something after the referendum, and I think people in the government are kind of exhausted by this also. But there is a sense that in 2024 we want to hear more about some new solutions at a federal level to make sure we're having those national voices involved in the policy debate.
All right, our panel, Bridget Brennan, David Crowe, Sam Maiden, will be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer-at-large for The Guardian Australia. We've come to the Museum of Australian Democracy here at Old Parliament House, where the Behind the Lines exhibition opened this week, and the winner is, drumroll please, Political Cartoonist of the Year, the one and only Fiona Katauskas.
Thank you, Mike. It's yes, extremely delightful to be here.
There's no longer 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, there's 7. You've added a couple: plague, climate change and AI.
It just felt like 2023 was one of those years, wasn't it? We just kept getting more, and we've got a couple of people here saying, I liked it so much better when there were only 4 of them as the new AI horsemen. Hey guys.
David Rowe here has got the Prime Minister trying to scale this mountain that's very brown.
Yeah, we've got the creature from the Brown Lagoon, it looks like. I'm not sure what the chicken feet are about, but David Rowe is always full of bizarre references.
Yeah, and Tony Abbott's Speedo's there. He's pulling us into a winning position, I'll give him that. That's David Littleproud, I think.
I actually think this is a very apt political metaphor, Mike, because when there's a political dacking going on, everyone's looking at the dacky and not the possible moral swamp that the dacker is coming from.
Yes.
So, yeah.
I've noticed he has Qantas Lounge undies on here.
Oh, do you get those in the Qantas Lounge?
Well, I've never been in the Chairman's Lounge, so I wouldn't know. I did love this Matt Golding cartoon. He's turned Sisyphus into an executive game. Halfway into his first term, he's dealing with the cost of living,
the housing and rental crisis,
polls,
stage 3 tax cuts,
and he's about to unleash here fear and division. It's a beautifully drawn.
It is, and that is such a good metaphor as well. And like the Prime Minister's sort of dealing with the gravity of the situation, and Peter Dutton's just dealing with the laws of gravity, which make it so much easier.
Yeah, Yeah. The cover band T-shirt collection has John Kadelka here. He's got the AUKUS T-shirt.
Stage 3 tax cuts.
Safeguard mechanism, rock on!
Yeah, whatever Peter Dutton says about refugees. It's sort of like the Albanese beats, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's definitely not Rage Against the Machine, that's for sure.
A lovely Kathy Wilcox cartoon who sums up the position that the Prime Minister's in. You're just afraid you'll be seen as compassionate towards refugees.
No, I will not.
You're scared people will think you care about climate change.
That's not true, I don't.
You're frightened they'll find out you think the wealthy don't deserve a tax cut.
No, I don't. How dare you? Ha, I really showed him who's boss.
Brett Letherbridge's cartoon, The Cost of Living It Up, sums this whole predicament up perfectly. Doing it tough, hey mate, says Jim Chalmers.
Oh my God, have you seen the price of a European holiday?
Stage 3 tax cuts should ease the burden, says the Prime Minister.
Well, I think this sums it up pretty perfectly. It's, we can all be reassured that at least the wealthy will, even if they do push up inflation, they'll be not troubled by it.
It is a wedge of their own making, however.
Totally.
Fiona, there was a mic drop in Canberra this week as Mr Pizzulo's public service career came to an abrupt end.
Yes, absolutely. It was kind of a surprise, even though it was sort of expected.
How Pizzulo can you go? I do love this David Pope cartoon.
It would seem a shame if the breaches of the Public Service Code overshadowed the impressive feat of imperial engineering. This looks like another one of those horsemen of the apocalypse.
Yeah,
maybe,
it does a bit.
Maybe the public service apocalypse, I'm not sure.
I did love this. It needs almost an accompaniment of music, doesn't it? Dum, 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 dum. Pizzulo showing the door as
yes, the force is no longer with him, is it?
No, the farce is no longer with him.
Oh.
Department of Home Affairs. Fiona, it was a sad week as the Pat in the Hat finally hung up his grand chapeau.
Yes, and father of reconciliation as well, a man who's had a huge career.
I can remember photographing him 30 odd years ago at the press club, and it was one of the first assignments I did. He's just always been a thorough gentleman, and this is a beautiful, beautiful David Rowe cartoon who's got the hat hanging on the flagpole here as he off into the distance.
People across the political spectrum will wish Pat Dodson all the best and have massive respect for his contribution.
Fiona, it's been a great pleasure. Political Cartoonist of the Year for Behind the Lines, and I'll let you do the honours.
Mike. Thanks, Mike, and back to you, David.
And a big congratulations to the well-deserved award winner there. Thank you, Fiona, and thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Quick one from me first. On Thursday, the Prime Minister of PNG, James Marape, will be in town meeting Anthony Albanese. Big announcement expected, I'm told. I expect it'll be the bilateral security treaty they've been negotiating all year. There's been a bit of to and fro over this and pushback internally in PNG, but it goes to stronger security and defence ties, and obviously the government will use that after its deal with Tuvalu to show that it is securing Australia's support in the region. Bridge.
Can I quickly have to? Pat Dodson, such a giant, and the Parliament will really be weaker in his absence because he has been such an advocate for our people. And secondly, 100 organisations were calling on state and territory attorneys general this week to raise the age of criminal responsibility. This has been an ongoing issue, but there are now a lot of medical organisations joining the call for governments to seriously consider whether it's a good idea to be locking children under the age of 14 up in detention.
David.
Just something to look out for next year. On Thursday, a parliamentary committee chaired by Julian Hill, a Labor MP, decided to set up an inquiry into the outsourcing of visa processing that was planned by the Morrison government. Didn't go ahead, cost taxpayers $90 million. That Australian visa processing contract will then, I think, raise questions about, Peter Dutton's management of Home Affairs. That's where Labor wants to go next year, and so watch out for that. And on another note, a colleague of mine, Fleeta, gave birth to a baby girl on Thursday night. So congratulations, Fleeta, and welcome to the world. Rio, a beautiful daughter.
Very nice. Sam.
On a less brighter note, it is going to be a very interesting Christmas for the Independent Parliamentary Expenses Authority on politicians' travel, because 1 year after the Albanese government just casually stopped publishing any material on politicians' flights, domestic, Comcar travel and the expenses from their office, they are going to start publishing it again after they had all these problems with the computer system, and we're going to see whether or not they are going to try to stop publishing details on politicians' Comcar travels using the same argument about national security that they did with the VIP flights.
Something to look forward to. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Finally, we'll find it a little frustrating when politicians don't answer questions. I know I do. But no one expresses it quite like radio legend Neil Mitchell, who hung up his headphones on Friday. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Meanwhile, Prime Minister, you wonder why the public is disenchanted. We hear this going on between the two sides, and you both carry a bit, I agree with that. And meanwhile, we've got people out in the community who are potentially dangerous who should not be in the community. You should be getting together and getting them under control instead of standing there throwing abuse at each other.
And that is what we did.
Prime Minister, you're the boss. You're the boss.
It's about time that Peter Dutton took responsibility for what he said.
So I'll repeat the question. Do you stand by what your ministers said?
Neil, I stand by everything that I say, and I stand by the fact that my ministers have been doing everything they can to protect community safety.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.